So right now we have basically began chemical and mechanical digestion. So we've taken that food, we've broken it apart with our teeth, and it's mixing with saliva right now with that salivary amylase, and it's starting to break down the carbohydrates in it. So now what we're going to do is we are going to start to swallow it, and we are going to go through the process of swallowing here in a second. But when we swallow it, it's going to go through our next couple of structures found in the upper GI tract, which is going to be the pharynx and the esophagus. So take a look quickly at the pharynx. Again, this is going to be that shared organ with the respiratory system. It is going to be a passageway for food and liquids, but also air. So it is a muscular passageway. It's going to have stratified squamous epithelium because of the fact that we still need protection there against any abrasions that we are about to swallow. If you think about it, haven't you ever chewed a piece of food but you didn't chew it quite enough? And you can kind of feel it digging down your throat. And that's exactly why we are going to have that stratified squamous there. There's also going to be some pairs of skeletal muscle, some pharyngeal constrictors in here as well. So not much to say about the pharynx. We're going to move on down to the esophagus here. So usually the esophagus is collapsed. It's only open if we have food or a bolus that is passing through it. So if you take a look at the esophagus in the picture, then we are going to have a couple of different sphincters here that is going to regulate the passage of food. And remember, we talked about how we have lots and lots of sphincters. And this is going to be one of them here. This book calls it the superior esophageal sphincter. You can also call it the upper esophageal sphincter if you want as well. So what this is, it's going to be a sphincter that is going to be that connection between the pharynx and the esophagus. So it's going to be skeletal muscle here. Typically what happens is that we'll go through this whole process of swallowing, but when we swallow, we are going to have this kind of ring of skeletal muscle here. And it's going to be skeletal muscle because what's happening here is we are going to go through and we are going to try and push that food through that pharynx in the first part of the esophagus as quickly as possible. Because we'll talk about here in a second, with swallowing, we do have a temporary cessation of breathing. So what happens is that superior esophageal sphincter is going to be closed during inhalation of air. So we'll actually go through and take a look at the different musculature of the esophagus and how it's different. That's going to help facilitate swallowing as well. So if we keep on going down, there's that going down the esophagus. We're going to have something called the esophageal hiatus, and that's just going to be a hole that the esophagus is going to pass through as it goes from the thoracic to the abdominal cavity there. And we'll talk about how hiatal hernias, that's where this happens. That's where the part of the stomach can actually protrude up above the diaphragm right there. It goes through that little hiatus right there. And at the very end, you're going to have another sphincter, and this sphincter is going to control that bolus of food going into the stomach. And again, we will talk about that here in swallowing. This one is called inferior here, but you can also call it lower esophageal sphincter. I typically call it lower esophageal sphincter. I've never referred to it as inferior, but this book does. So taking a look at the histology, the esophagus is going to have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Again, we still have this bolus of food that was very similar to what we had in the pharynx. So it is going to start pushing down the esophagus. But what's a little bit different here is that we are going to start to coat it with a little bit more mucus. So you have lots and lots of mucus that's being secreted here, here in the esophagus. And that is going to help kind of move that bolus down a little bit easier to the stomach. So the submucosa is going to have lots of elastic fibers. And if you remember elastic fibers from your 2401, remember that is going to allow for that expandability and then that recoil. So it is going to allow for distension whenever we swallow. So remember, it's going to, that esophagus is going to open up when we have a bolus of food, but then it has to collapse whenever we don't have a bolus of food. So that's the benefit of having those elastic fibers in here. So again, let's talk a little bit about that musculature of the esophagus. I got ahead of myself and I was talking about that upper esophageal sphincter and moving it rapidly through, but this is what I was talking about. So the first about third, you have 2 layers of skeletal muscle in the superior one-third portion of the esophagus. And the reason why is, remember the difference between skeletal, one of the differences between skeletal and smooth muscle is the fact that skeletal muscle contracts faster. Smooth muscle is going to contract very slowly. So if we want that bolus of food to move out of the pharynx as quickly as possible while that breathing is shut off, then we need to have skeletal muscle moving it through. So that's why that first portion is going to be skeletal muscle to help move that out. And then the rest of it is going to be smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle is going to extend all the way through the intestines, the small intestine, the large intestine, and the anus as well. So this is a great little picture over here to the side because it shows you what the esophagus looks like when there's nothing in it. It shows you how it's collapsed whenever there's nothing in it. All right, so let's take a look at swallowing here. So with swallowing, we're going to take a look at how there's going to be 3 different phases of swallowing. So swallowing, there's a fancy word for swallowing, of course, because in science we can't use just normal old names like swallowing. No, we can't. We have to give it a fancy name like deglutition, and that is going to be the nice little name for swallowing. So that is moving the ingested materials from the oral cavity to the stomach. So there's going to be 3 phases. You're going to have your voluntary phase, you're going to have your pharyngeal phase, and your esophageal phase. And really what the last 2 are going to refer to is where they are located, where that bolus is located. So let's first start with the voluntary phase, which is going to occur right after ingestion. And what happens here is that you are making a bolus with your mouth, your oral cavity. You're going in and you're taking that food and you're mixing it with saliva, and then you're going to pack it all in this nice little ball, and that's going to be your bolus of food. And then what you're going to do is you're going to start to push it towards the back of the throat, which is going to be basically pushing it towards the oropharynx. So remember, the other name for pharynx is going to be, the common name is going to be throat. And then that is going to be what you're pushing it against, the throat, which is going to be your oropharynx. And of course, your tongue is going to do that. It's going to help push it. So all of this is actually going to be controlled by the cerebral cortex here. So let's move on and take a look and see what happens as soon as we push that bolus of food back towards the oropharynx. Then as it moves into the oropharynx, this is where it's going to switch from voluntary to an involuntary reflex. So really after this, you don't have any control over it. It can't be in the middle of your esophagus and you'd be like, oh, you know what? My bad, I didn't mean to swallow that, and then bring it up. Unless, of course, you make yourself gag, but that's completely different. So your pharyngeal, I've also heard it that way, is going to be involuntary. So what happens is it's initiated by sensory input to swallowing, to this swallowing center you have in the medulla. We'll actually talk about a lot of these little centers you have in the medulla here. We'll talk about the vomiting center later. Here's your swallowing center in the medulla. So as this happens, as the bolus of food pushes against the oropharynx, the soft palate in the uvula, here it is right here, there's that soft palate in the uvula, that is, as you can see, that is elevated here, and it is closing off that nasopharynx. Remember I talked about this in the previous section, how it goes in and closes off that nasal cavity to make sure that that food is going to go down where it needs to go. Another thing that happens, as you can see, there's that epiglottis. Remember how I talked about the epiglottis is made up of elastic cartilage? You see how it's elastic? Because it's actually bending over like this, and it is completely closing off that larynx, which leads to, of course, the lungs. So this is key to making sure that the food goes down the right pipe, right? And the water as well, because if that other pipe is open, then that's where you get problems like with aspiration, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But what this is going to be where our respiration is going to stop. Just for a second, doesn't stop very long. When you swallow, you cannot breathe. So, and you might have tried it right now, trying to prove me wrong, right? I can breathe when I swallow. No, whenever you swallow, you actually, breathing is going to stop. If you take a look, this is showing you why right here. You are going to have that epiglottis that completely closes off the larynx, so you can't have air pass. At all. So remember, that is going to be that importance of the skeletal muscle, because we're about to move it into the esophagus, and now we need it to move through very quickly at that very beginning part. So here's the esophageal phase. This is going to be another involuntary phase when the bolus of food passes the esophagus here. So as it goes into the esophagus, the uvula, the soft palate, the epiglottis, they all return to their normal pre-swallowing conditions. So now it is open and you can breathe again. As soon as it passes that upper esophageal sphincter, that sphincter is going to close to make sure that that bolus does not come back up. So that's really important as well. So the bolus of food is going to move down, down, down. It's going to go all the way down the esophagus. And as the bolus of food moves down, then that lower esophageal sphincter is going to open. Typically, it is always going to be closed, because what's happening here is that it is going through and it's making sure that gastric juice or hydrochloric acid isn't coming up into the esophagus. It's making sure that it's closed off. So as the bolus of food moves down, it gets that signal that it needs to open because there's food coming down. So it's going to open up, and then it is going to, of course, go into the stomach. Now, one key thing is how is the bolus of food moving? Peristalsis. This is where peristalsis begins. It's going to be right here in this phase. So that is going to be key. So typically, and this is kind of not really related to swallowing, but this has to do with that that lower esophageal sphincter, because we're actually about to talk about acid reflux disease. But that sphincter down there is actually relatively weak. So it relies on the contraction of the diaphragm down there at the bottom to help make sure that it stays closed and make sure that materials don't come up from the stomach.